Hey guys, you got Crave here, and it's really been a long while since I was able to get some cadence or some form of regularity in a raiding sense. The last time I did this was in Warlords of Draenor, I think, and I'm really just happy to have a regular schedule of sorts for group content. So I thought I'd make a guide for my main class and spec at the moment, which is the Resto Druid. This is really just meant for people who are newish to the game or who are interested in trying out the healing role as a druid. So as in previous videos, this will be sectioned off, which really makes me miss the annotations feature of YouTube. Anyway, you can jump right into the one you want based on these timestamps, or you can just use the description box for the parts you want to directly get into. If you don't jump into a specific time or topic, then I'll start with some generic tips. Now, tip number one is for leveling, and it really doesn't matter how you want to level your character. You can level as a cat, as a bear, or as a chicken. It really doesn't matter. But what matters is that if you're running group content, you have to try out or push for the healing role. You have to get used to things. You have to get used to your spells. Now, some of these leveling dungeons are pretty easy, I know, but it doesn't matter. You have to get used to your role. Now, tip number two is really just setting your expectations. You have to understand whether you're just a casual player who will probably just run normal raids or some low-key dungeons, or if you're someone who wants to be a part of a top 100 guild. Of course, the expectations and the pace for either goal is very different, so you have to understand where you fit in. This basically means adjusting your effort allocation and your pace depending on the end goal or the goals you have at endgame. Tip number three revolves around the covenant choices. Basically, what this means is that up until level 59, it doesn't matter which covenant you pick. You can always switch around, change it up, whatever you feel like, test the abilities as much as you want. So this is basically the period for you to familiarize yourself with the covenant's main ability and secondary ability with no consequence if you decide to swap out. Tip number four is really just when someone goes down on your watch while you're healing, it's okay. Now, of course, there will be times when it can be discouraging, but it's really just okay if someone zeroes out while under your watch. You might encounter some asshats when it happens in random groups, and it really just happens. It's a thing in MMO games. It really happens. There are people with certain attitudes. Just remember that it does happen sometimes, and not all people are like that. Basically, just don't get discouraged. And the last tip, of course, there are other tips, but the last one I can mention is really just knowledge or mechanics of the instance. And knowledge of the instance mechanics are extremely important. Restoration Druids are not helpless in trying to react quickly to big damage, but we're not really the best at it. So being able to anticipate raid or group-wide critical moments are key to being a useful member of the raid. Okay, so we can safely move on to the stat priority section, and this one will be sort of quick. So a lot of this again will depend on what you want to achieve, as I mentioned earlier. Normal raids and low keys will only need to worry about intellect stacking, which just simply means just looking at the items or looking for the items with the highest item level. Once you start pushing for high dungeon keys or mythic raids and the pace is pretty hectic, you'll want to give your secondary stats more attention. I suggest stats like haste and mastery. Knowing which one you need more will really depend on the encounters and the performance you have based on logs. Your stat priority also determines how you enchant your gear, which also means it also determines how or which potions you want to consume and similar buff priorities. In addition, this also helps to determine the secondary stats for your legendary item when you get to craft them. So again, if you're just running normal raids or low-key content, then it's fine if you just stack intellect, maybe give some attention to a specific secondary stat. But if you are going for mythic content, mythic raids, or high mythic keys, then you definitely have to give attention to secondary stats, and that will depend on the performance logs you have for previous fights and of course the strategy of your raid. Moving on to the challenge section, so let's start with row number 1. And I normally run with Abundance since Resto Druids do drop a lot of rejuvenation spells. This makes regrowth casts more efficient. You may also want to consider Cenarian Ward as it is also very efficient. This is a good pick for smaller groups or if you are assigned to focus on specific people in your raid team. For the second row, I just normally run with Wild Charge. But the only problem with this specific ability or talent is that it requires a group member to be in this spot where you want to reposition yourself. If you absolutely need shorter bursts of speed, then I would suggest Tiger Dash. It's really something you can go with. For the third row, I normally run with Guardian Affinity so that I worry less about myself. It has the benefit of damage reduction for yourself, plus you can throw in a Frenzied regen if you really need it. This is also a good talent to start with if you are just learning the healing role. If you want to help out with your group's damage output, Balance Affinity is another option. The additional range benefit for your spells is also pretty good if your group strat involves being spread out. Row number 4 will depend on the situational needs, but I just go with Heart of the Wild. This particular talent really just buffs your pick for the third row, so among other benefits, when I go into bear form with the Guardian Affinity talent for the third row, I also gain 20% more stamina. So it really just buffs the flexibility talent option for row number 3. For the fifth row, you can try out Cultivation if you are just starting out, as it requires very little management on your part. It's a basic enhancement of your rejuvenation spell when targets are often low on health. Now, once you get familiar with healing or with the situation and things, I strongly suggest going with Soul of the Forest. It's a very flexible talent that can really help in many situations. Soul of the Forest can help targets that are in need of dire healing. Heavy damage that is also spread out can also be managed better by a buffed wild growth to the same talent. Now, for King of the Jungle, this is also a useful talent if you absolutely need another strong cooldown in your arsenal. For row number 6, it will either be Spring Blossoms or Tranquility. Now, Spring Blossoms is a buff for your Efflorescence spell, so it means it is better off for fights where people are stacked together. This means that it also requires little to no management, as you would often target grouped up players. Now, Inner Peace lowers the CD of a major spell, which means being able to at least get off 2 Tranquility channels in a single fight. This is also a very strong talent. Just make sure you're using it optimally and you coordinate with fellow healers when in a raid group. For the final row, I just basically run with Flourish, and it's really just another cooldown in your arsenal. The talent extends the duration of all your heal effects and improves their rate of healing. Provided you've spread out your hot effects, it's like seeing another Tranquility spell and its numbers just flying in your screen when you use it. It's great for managing raid-wide damage. Still on the final row, I have to mention Photosynthesis, as it is another great talent as it allows flexibility depending on how you want to use Life Bloom. If Life Bloom is on you, then all your hot effects heal faster, and if it's on someone else, then your Life Bloom will have a chance to proc the final heal or the bloom effect of the spell without removing the Life Bloom spell itself. This offers a lot of flexibility on how you want to heal your group. Having the Dark Titan Legendary allows for both photosynthesis effects to be fully utilized. So this is really another talent option you can go with, and it's definitely something you should think about if you are running with the appropriate Lego. Now, for the Covenant choice, this is really just a contentious part of the video. Most classes and specs will gravitate towards a choice because they observe numbers or hear the numbers from other people running the same spec and class, or performance based on whatever aspect of the game. It could be Mythic Keys, PvP, or it could be just simply because of a theme. Now, if you're starting out and don't plan to run with progression groups, or if you're only concerned with basic use of the Covenant abilities and soulbinds, then any choice is fine. Go with the flavor faction you want. Just like the stat priority section, the Covenant choice will matter when going for higher difficulty content or higher rating in PvP. For my part, I went Night Fae because of the Soulbind and their main class ability. Now, the Dreamweaver Soulbind, which is the Soulbind you can get, has the talent option called Empowered Chrysalis. Now, that particular trait has the ability to make a small part of your overheals useful in that it shields your target with sort of a mini barrier. Now, it won't be like what the Disciplined Priests have, but it does help in the preemptive healing part. Also, Convoke the Spirits is really just a useful mini cooldown that doesn't cost any mana. There is a certain randomness to it, but it really can help with the raid-wide damage. You can also pair it with the Flourish talent to enhance the mini cooldown aspect of it. Now, Soul Shape, the generic ability for the faction, is really just minimized because you're a druid, but quickly repositioning yourself or having another option to reposition yourself is always a useful ability. Now, some examples of this may be being the one closest to catching the anima bottles in the lady fight, or you could be trying to run away from the artifact effect in Simos' room. Yeah, so as a druid, Soul Shape still has its uses. If the Night Fae flavor isn't for you, then I would suggest the Venthyr faction. I really almost picked this one when I hit level 60. Now, the ravenous ability of the faction is quite strong in that it also functions as a mini cooldown with a ramp up time depending on the number of spells you cast within its 20 seconds window. Now, the downside of this particular ability is that the CD is quite long at 3 minutes and that the spell cast or the spells you throw still cost mana. For the generic ability, their Door of Shadows skill is useful in that it helps with repositioning and also has a very cool effect. Now, my druid is also an alchemist, so for the Venthyr faction, they also have some soulbind traits that really help to enhance your flasks and your potion use. Now, they also have a trait called Thrill Seeker. It's a passive that is also nice to have as a benefit when in fights. It's a stack building ability that when it's filled up, it gives your druid a 20% haste buff for a number of seconds, so that's a pretty nice ability to have. So overall, the Venthyr faction isn't so bad, but I really just went with Night Fae. So here's a rundown of some key abilities that you need to watch out for as a Restoration Druid. Now, I won't go over talents or abilities that are added based on your picks, like Ursol's Vortex. I do suggest going over those affinity spells as they can be quite useful to your raid group. Now, lastly, I will omit some damaging spells, but keep in mind that you will eventually have to make use of them once you start getting more comfortable, and it also becomes mandatory for harder content. Let's go over your utility spells, and the first one is Barkskin. So it's a damage mitigation spell on yourself. Now, what's really great about this skill or this ability is that you can use it even though you're stunned, you're feared, or some other loss of control effect is on you. So just feel free to use it if you're at risk of going zero. The second utility spell is Cyclone. Now, if you want to be able to take out or just remove from action one particular mob that isn't immune to it, then this is the spell you use. It's really useful because really it's like that mob won't be able to do anything and it doesn't break on damage. So feel free to use it if you want to isolate one particular enemy. Entangling Roots is another crowd control effect. Now, it's not a complete control on the mob or the enemy, mainly because the enemy can still do damage to you at ranged, but at least you can stop off or stave off some melee mobs before they get to you. One other thing you have to note about this ability is that you can break the root effect on damage, so be careful when doing this. Hibernate is another sleep effect or crowd control effect on a beast or dragonkin creature. Now, one thing about this spell is that it easily breaks on any kind of damage, so unlike your Entangling Roots, there's a chance it will break on damage. For Hibernate, it definitely just breaks on even a point or a single point of damage. Now, Rebirth is a very important spell. Now, it can be confused with other names. Sometimes they call it Battle Breath, so if you're a healer, I think that's something you have to get familiar with. Now, this is something you want to make sure you are checking with your raid lead. Usually, they'll have an idea of who should be the target of the Rebirth. Now, it could be the top damage dealer, it could be another tank, normally, yeah, like those roles, or it could also be a fellow healer, but it's still best to make sure or confirm with your raid lead. Soothe is a very simple ability in that it just removes enrage effects. Now, always use this when you get the chance. It really makes some sections of fights, even the trash mobs, much easier if you just use this instead of healing through damage. Now, the last utility spell I can mention is Stampeding Roar, and it's really just a great boon or benefit for your raid group or your dungeon group. It quickly allows you to reposition yourself along with a number of other people in the group to just get out of the bad or just move into an optimal spot for damage dealing. So overall, it's really just a great benefit. Okay, now let's move on to your roster of healing spells. So the first one is Efflorescence. Now, it's basically an AoE healing effect. And it requires or it's better used for stacked up members of the raid group. Now, there's an important interaction I want to mention here in that if you pick the talent Spring Blossoms in your talents section, then it's really just a great pick because it adds or gives an additional benefit to Efflorescence. The next healing spell I want to mention is Flourish, and I mentioned this earlier. What it really just does is two things. It extends the duration of all your heal over time effects, and it improves their rate of healing. So this spell has many interactions as it basically touches on all heal over time effects. So it's a very important raid cooldown that you have to manage. Enervate is the third spell I want to mention, and it really just basically means that in a 10-second window, someone doesn't have to use up mana when casting their spells. Now, this is really another spell that you might want to coordinate with fellow healers or your raid leader. It's best not to cast Innervate on yourself as the healing roles usually share the healing burden in some form. So it's best to coordinate with one another, and it's best that all healers have healthy mana pool, so don't be selfish for this particular spell. The next spell is Iron Bark. So it's basically a damage reduction or a DR ability that lasts for 12 seconds. It also has the additional benefit of increasing the heal over time effects or the effectiveness of your HOTS on a particular target. So basically you just want to use this on a tank or someone who is in need of dire healing. So another heal over time effect in the form of Life Bloom, so it's basically a 15-second hot. Now the additional component to it is that it has a bloom or instant heal effect when the Life Bloom expires or is removed. So it's a single target only spell. Now one thing I want to mention about this one is that it interacts pretty well with the photosynthesis talent, especially if you have the Dark Titan Lego or the Dark Titan Legendary. So the legendary basically means that it allows for 2 targets for your Life Bloom spell. So as I mentioned earlier in the talent section, this is really just great for the photosynthesis talent. Now next up is Nature's Cure. It's a standard spell that removes 1 magic, curse, or poison effect. Now the spell abilities like this and like Soothe for enrage effects are often ignored by many healers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, many times it lightens your load as a healer if you can just simply remove a negative effect rather than healing through it. So as mentioned, these spells may be standard, but they're very, very useful. Nature Swiftness is another spell that's really useful. So what it does is that it affects regrowth, rebirth, and entangling roots. What it does is that for those spells, they can be instantly cast and in any form. In addition, regrowth heals for 100% more. Next up is Rejuvenation, and it's also a key spell, at the same time a key identifier of what Restoration Druid healing is like. So Rejuvenation is basically just a standard 15-second heal over time effect. Now I just want to mention that there's also a legendary associated with this one. It's called Vision of Unending Growth. So what this does, or what the Lego does, is that there's a 2.5% chance to create a new Rejuve effect on a nearby target. So it's a small chance, but you will be blanketing most of the time most of your raid members with this particular heal over time effect. Swiftmend is one of those key abilities that is very rare for druids in that they can immediately heal someone who's in need of dire healing. So what it does is that it consumes a heal over time effect on a target to just basically push up their health. Now, I want to mention that it also has an interaction with the Soul of the Forest talent. Now, as I mentioned in that section, once you get comfortable with things, it's really important that you go with Soul of the Forest so that you can have more options. But basically, by itself, Swiftmend is really just great in terms of saving someone from dying. Tranquility is another spell that's also key to the Druid, although I think Holy Priests have something similar, but I could be wrong. In any case, this is a very strong cooldown that also needs to be timed with fellow healers' raid cooldowns. You don't want all your cooldowns or your healers' cooldowns to be used in one phase, when big damage also has to be managed in another part of the fight. The last spell that I want to mention is Wild Growth, although it is still very useful for druids. Now, what this does is that it targets 6 injured allies with heal over time effects. You just have to take note that the healing effect declines in a 7-second period. I also want to mention that there is a legendary that you can use with this particular spell. It's called Memory of the Mother Tree. Now what this does is that it simply gives Wild Growth a 40% chance to proc additional copies of your Rejuvenation or Regrowth spells on allies within 20 yards of the targets of those spells. Now for add-on to macros, I know that some people don't appreciate the fact that other players use add-ons, so you can just skip this part if this is not to your liking. But for those who like using add-ons, I do have a few suggestions. So the first one is ELVUI, and it's something I constantly suggest in any of the guide videos I make for World of Warcraft. It's really just a great replacement for the standard UI in World of Warcraft, so head on over to tukui.org if that's something you want to check out. The second one is Click. So as the name implies, it just really makes it easier for you to heal by clicking on raid frames or even hovercasting on raid frames so that you can maintain your current target while healing the hovercast target. That's pretty useful. And the next one is Details. So if you know add-ons like SCADA or the sort, then Details is a similar add-on, although it is a lighter add-on as I've been told, and it offers more details in terms of how you behaved in fights, or at least the numbers that are being thrown off in fights. And the last add-on I want to mention is Tell Me When. So it's really just an add-on that allows you to track abilities, cooldowns, procs based on what you want to monitor. So it doesn't show you everything immediately, so it lets you choose and configure the ones you want to watch. And with that, I also want to mention it's really just highly configurable. So it's another add-on I really recommend. Now for macros, I'm showing you guys right now a very simple one. It's a simple mouse over macro that you can use for your healing spells. So what it does is basically you can maintain your target and at the same time hover above a raid frame or above an ally in the group and just cast your healing spell. So if you don't like using click as an add-on, then this is something you can do, but it does mean creating similar macros for every single spell in your spellbook, or at least every single healing spell. Now, there's a ton of other macros out there. Just make sure to get them from reputable sources or sources you trust. So maybe in the WoW forums or maybe sites like Wowhead. Again, just make sure you pick the ones that aren't broken or that may have a chance of breaking your game. I'm not even sure if that can happen, if macros can break World of Warcraft. But yeah, just be careful. But yeah, try to use macros. They really just make life easier for you. And that's it for this guide on how you can heal as a Restoration Druid. I really didn't expect this to be this long, but I really hope this helps you if you're just starting out, or maybe encourage you to give the Druid's Restoration spec a try. Anyway, it's been too long, but thanks for checking this out, guys. I'll talk to you soon.